Thank you for joining us, everyone. I'm Megan McAdow. I'm the director at the Marshall Fredericks Sculpture Museum, located on the campus of Saginaw Valley State University. As many of you know, we're not currently open to the general public. So what we've been doing is working really hard to take our exhibition program and make them into virtual exhibitions so that everyone can enjoy them. And we did that with our current exhibition. Oops, which I just disappeared everything. Let's see here. There we go. Form Foundations, Figure Studies by Marshall Fredericks. And in this virtual exhibition, you can do 360-degree virtual tours. You can walk through the galleries and zoom in on the different artworks there. You can also learn more about Marshall Fredericks and about his drawing talents, as well as how they served him in creating his wonderful sculptures. And let's see what else is on there. Also, our calendar events, which many of you may have already discovered because that is how many people registered for tonight's event. We also have some other fantastic programming scheduled with this exhibition, where you can learn about figure drawing from a local expert, really. I mean, phenomenal. And also, if you want to try your hand at it by drawing a live model, we have a virtual program for that. So check out our calendar of events and our programming. I do want to mention that the exhibition and tonight's program are supported by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, as well as the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. And we so appreciate them. I'll just take 1 second to, you may have read in the tonight's program description a little bit about the drawings and why we have our paper conservator, Liz Sorokin, with us tonight. We, in our archives, have close to 130 of Marshall Fredericks figure studies. And back in 2010, we received a grant to have them assessed, both for their condition as well as their curatorial merit. And of those 129 drawings, 25 of them were selected to be conserved. And we, for the last 3 years, they've been at the Midwest Art Conservation Center in Minneapolis, getting very careful treatments, which you're going to hear all about tonight. And they just came back to the museum in December. We had them framed, we've installed them, and then we built the virtual exhibition for you. So just before we get into the talk with Liz, just a little bit of housekeeping information. Please keep yourselves on mute while she's talking. But at the end of her presentation, we will definitely invite you to ask questions and unmute yourself. You can also at any point just enter a question into the chat box on Zoom, and I will do my best to relay those questions to Liz. Okay, so just a brief note about our guest speaker, Liz Sorokin. She received her master's degree and certificate of advanced study in art conservation with a specialization in works on paper from the State University of New York, Buffalo State. Liz has worked at the St. Louis Art Museum, Northwestern University Library, Brooklyn Museum, and the Art Institute of Chicago. In 2016, she completed the Cragen W. Bowen Paper Conservation Fellowship at the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies, part of the Harvard Art Museums. And she is currently an associate paper conservator at the Midwest Art Conservation Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and so we can focus on Liz Sorokin.
All right, so I will start sharing mine. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is having a nice evening. So today I'll be talking about our project that, as Megan alluded to, we've been working on for the past 3 years, but actually much longer if we consider when the first survey was carried out in 2010 of conserving these drawings for the Marshall Fredericks Museum. So first I'm going to talk a bit about conservation as a whole, just sort of an introduction on how we work, what we do, how you become a conservator, and then I'll dive deep into the project with the Marshall Fredericks. So I work as one of the 2 paper conservators at the Midwest Art Conservation Center based here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My colleague Diana Kleiss is on the right. You can see here, she is the other paper conservator who works in our lab. We also have labs devoted to paintings conservation, which you see 2 of our paintings conservators on the left here. Christy Jeffcoat on the bottom and Rita Berg on the top, working on a very large Frank Stella painting for the Minneapolis Institute of Art. We also have an objects conservation department, and they work on everything from 3-dimensional. So that can include anything from porcelain and glass to outdoor sculpture. A textiles department that works on things like historic costumes, flags, and textiles. And also a preventive conservation department that works sort of more with collections holistically. So we at the Midwest Art Conservation Center, we're a regional center, which means we work with smaller institutions that may not have a devoted conservation lab, as well as so places like historical societies, small, university art museums, and also private collectors and kind of communities such as like tribal community collections. So we work really we work very broadly, and we work with a really wide variety of objects, which makes our work very exciting. And so the preventive conservation department will often go to sites and sort of advise more on collections holistically, looking at things like environmental conditions or storage, while we work in the specialty labs on individual objects. So what does that mean exactly? As conservators, our job is to ensure the long-term stability of art and cultural artifacts. So we look at the materials and we look at the objects themselves, and we work alongside both professional experts and caretakers, clients who to sort of develop a way to take care of things. So we stabilize works and sometimes somewhat restore them, but we're not restorers. We're really looking at the long term and ensuring that things can last as long as possible. So while sometimes our jobs are somewhat restorative, we're really looking to conserve, hence our name. And so in order to really know how to do that, we go through a pretty extensive amount of training. It begins in undergraduate education, where we are expected to take a certain amount of art history or archaeology coursework, chemistry coursework, and studio art coursework. And then in addition to that, to have pre-program experience. A big part of conservation training is to kind of like the mentorship of learning alongside trained conservators how to look at art, how to handle art, and how to treat art, how to stabilize things. Once you have a certain amount of pre-program experience, you can then apply to graduate programs. There are 4 graduate programs in the United States, only 3 of which offer the specialization in works on paper, one of which is pictured here in my alma mater and at Buffalo State. But there are also programs in NYU and the University of Delaware. And there is this 4th program that specializes specifically in archaeological artifacts and ethnographic artifacts at UCLA. There is 1 program in Canada. So and these programs are small. There was 10 people in my class. So it's very, very specialized. And when we're in graduate training, it's a 3-year-long program, 2 years that are spent on campus, taking coursework on material science, technical art history, and continuing developing our knowledge and experience with conservation treatments. And then a 3rd year, which is a 1-year-long kind of practicum experience, which I completed at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I essentially was a paper conservator. I worked alongside the paper conservators and they guided me, but I was given projects, I was given reports to write, and did the sort of day-to-day activities. And then in most cases, but not always, people go on to a postgraduate fellowship. So I don't know if this is a funny story, but interesting thing is Paper conservation finds a lot of its roots in Japanese screen and scroll mounting traditions. You can see these beautiful Japanese brushes behind me, and we do use them sometimes. When I first found out about this, I found out that it takes, I believe, 8 years to become a trained screen and scroll mounter, and that's 8 years of kind of a mentorship training program. But when I finally got my very first job in conservation after graduating, after all of these experiences, after a fellowship, it took me a total of 8 years. So it takes a while to become a conservator. When it comes to being a paper conservator, our job is really focused on works on paper. So that can include things like drawings, prints, watercolors, pastels. In this picture here, I'm working actually on a piece of parchment that's a Medici manuscript where I'm consolidating the flaking paint. But we also will sometimes work with photographs and books. There are specialists who do really complex treatments, but when the issue is the paper itself, sometimes we actually can't do those treatments. In addition to actual treatment work, we will advise on things like installation, storage, how to move things. You know, how do you move a pastel from Chicago to New York for an exhibition? We can kind of work with you to figure out the best and safest way to do so. We also carry out condition-based surveys, which again, Megan alluded to, happened at the Marshall Fredericks quite a few years ago. And during all of this, we do a lot of examination and documentation. That's a really huge part of our work. And it's really important because in terms of being kind of ethical, our ethical training and ethical guidelines teach us to be very transparent in everything we do. And our reports outline every decision we make so that in the future, if someone sees our work, they can be like, oh, so she did that. But also so that they can potentially undo things that maybe, you know, history has shown were not the ideal interventions, but also just to kind of really track how things have changed over time. A lot of the work of a conservator is undoing historic restorations, including things as simple as taking off a piece of tape, because that's kind of a restoration, right? But our work is really kind of making sure that we're doing everything as kind of conscientiously as we can and writing everything down. Documentation is very important and is also part of our coursework in graduate school, an entire class for 2 years devoted to documentation. So with that, I can start talking a bit about MACC and our work with the drawings of the Marshall Fredericks.
Thanks, Liz. Is there any way that you could go just a teeny slower too?
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's just a little bit of an echo, so I think maybe if you go a little bit slower, it's very minor, I think.
Okay.
But if you, yeah.
So I'm sorry about that.
No.
So as Megan mentioned, Elizabeth Bouchard, who was pictured here, was the senior paper conservator at the time in 2010. She has since retired and is enjoying her retirement. Came to the Marshall Fredericks and examined 129 drawings and worked alongside the curatorial department to select 25 for treatment. So this was all grant funded by the NEH, and that means that this project the Marshall Fredericks had started this project even before 2010. So this is a long time coming. When she looked at the drawings, she also composed some treatment proposals that outlined what she believed would be the best protocol for treating these 25 works that were selected. And so in 2018, the works arrived to the MACC paper labs. Elizabeth had retired and Diane and I were presented with drawings we had never seen before. It was sort of, like opening presents. We didn't know what was inside. And so here I am looking at one of the drawings as it's just come into the lab and looking at the condition issues. So what we saw amongst the collection was a lot of similar condition issues. The most noticeable thing you can even see here in this image is the overall paper discoloration. These were sketches. A lot of them are very loose and gestural and really kind of developing ideas and forms. And so because of that, they were completed on these sort of thin, pretty, not fine art papers. They're sort of lower quality. And over time, the paper itself has sort of started to deteriorate. It started to discolor. It started to become very brittle. In some cases, very, very brittle. And that was really noticeable across all of the collection. All of the drawings that came in were completed in what appeared to be a black chalk. That was, as Elizabeth noted in her examinations, that was very it was very fixed. So essentially the artist had likely sprayed a fixative on the drawing. And what that had done had taken this powdery media and sort of put a thin layer of fixative on the surface. And what that did was it really kind of pushed the drawing into the paper a bit more, kind of sinking it just a little bit, but also securing it. So it sort of worked to protect it. So we did notice that it was still, the drawing media was still powdery in some areas, but in a lot of areas it was actually very well secured to the paper surface. In addition to the really unstable paper, we noticed that the boards that the drawings were attached to were very acidic as well. So they were extremely yellowed, suggesting acidity, and also very brittle. And these thin pieces of paper were taped at, in many cases, were taped at all four edges directly to these window mats. So we have this thin, brittle paper, drawing paper, attached with really strong, thick tape, this adhesive that's really still actually tacky in most cases, and then attached to an additional, at all four edges, attached to this secondary window mat. And so you kind of have this drawing pulled kind of like a drum. And if you think about just any fluctuations in humidity or temperature can cause different papers to move and rattle, and that can put a lot of stress on this paper. So we were really seeing a lot of issues that luckily in this situation were not causing too much damage, but could present a lot of issues down the line. So we started to think about how, and Elizabeth had already done this, how do we stabilize these highly unstable drawings? And we came up with a sort of general treatment protocol, and each object was treated individually, and the treatment was varied based on the needs of each individual object. But because so many of them exhibited the same condition issues, I'm going to go through the kind of treatments that we carried out on the group. So the first thing we determined was, the first thing that was important was just to release the drawings from the window mats. That would take some of that stress off of the paper, and it would remove it from those window mats that were so acidic they were just brown. And the other thing about the window mats is that they would off gas. So if you were storing the drawing in, let's say, a cylinder box, you would have the acidity from the window mat kind of entering into the air and kind of off gassing and directly causing the paper to become more acidic as well. We also felt it was important to remove the tapes and reduce all the associated adhesive on the back, because in some cases the adhesive was actually stronger than the paper itself, and it was starting to really embed into the paper and would cause, again, more deterioration over time, embrittling and damaging that paper. And then we felt if it was possible, we would try to reduce the acidity and discoloration in the drawings. So as paper ages, it gets yellow and it gets brittle. And we are actually able to reduce that acidity by washing works on paper. And by doing that, we can reduce that acidity in the paper, sort of try to introduce a sort of an alkaline buffer with calcium hydroxide. And that can sort of slow the natural deterioration process of paper while also removing the acidic deterioration products that are actually kind of orange in color. So it can shift the paper back to sort of more of its original color while also stabilizing the sort of, they're slowing down the natural deterioration. We can't stop it. That's just how objects are, they age, but we can slow it down. And finally, we always, the most important thing was to ensure the stability of the drawing media itself. The drawing is the most important part. And so we wanted to make sure that we maintained the quality of the drawing and the mark making that was so visible in each of these works. So with that in mind, I will start going through treatment. So as we kind of had peeked a little bit, here is a quick video of me releasing this drawing from the mat. And all I did was took a scalpel and cut along the adhesive edge, avoiding the edge of the paper, of course, cutting that tape so that we could release each drawing individually. And so you can see here is the drawing released. And you can see if you look along the edges, the tape is still pulling at that paper, and you can see the distortions in the paper from that tape and that adhesive. And that's really suggesting that the adhesive is stronger than the paper and is really going to kind of cause more damage over time. The next step was to surface clean the drawing, and this was performed with a combination of white vinyl erasers, kneaded erasers, and cosmetic sponges, and it was performed selectively. So we did not draw, even though all of our testing suggested the drawing media was relatively stable, we did not surface clean over the actual lines or any passages of mark making. We only kind of surface cleaned in areas where it was kind of just blank paper. And so in terms of deciding how to clean, I think a great example is, as you can see, it's actually the lower left corner of this drawing, but in this image, it's the top left corner. You can see those kind of squiggles. And those are sort of the sign of the artist's process. He's working to refine probably his pencil shape or to get a sense of how to refine his tool and the pressure he wants to add. And so we wouldn't remove something like that because that's a sign of process. We're just really trying to get dirt off the surface. And I like to laugh that I went to graduate school to learn how to erase things off of paper, but it is really important as a paper conservator to do it really selectively and conscientiously, because with paper, every mark may mean something. The next step we performed was to actually release the tape from the drawings. So here you can see I used a hot tool to carefully melt the adhesive layer and pull up that paper tape. So the paper tape, the adhesive layer was still very, very tacky and really thick, even after removing this tape carrier. So the next step was to reduce the adhesive. This was performed over suction. So here you can see a selection of the drawing. And what we found was once we removed the window mat, there was additional adhesive applied to the drawing that had completely failed. So you can see these thick globs of adhesive, and we placed it directly over a suction table, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's attached to a vacuum and it just pulls. And we can work by using that, we can actually really work locally, and we can pull something through a piece of paper. So in this case, we use solvents that you'll see me start applying here. And we applied acetone, and it solubilized that adhesive and pulled it through onto that blotter below. So this is obviously a very sped up version of what I did, but you can see that the solvents are really saturating, but they're not moving very wide. They're pulling down, they're being pulled down by that vacuum. And that way I can avoid passages of drawing. I don't have to worry about everything moving laterally. So here it is, again, before, and then we can watch that again. You can see that pull, you can see all of that adhesive go out. And you can see that it was really effective in reducing that adhesive layer. So there we go. All right, and so here is here is an example of a before and after. On the left, you can see along that bottom margin all that adhesive, and on the right, you can see that it's been pulled out of the drawing. So once we had reduced the adhesive, once we had released the drawing from the window mat, reduced the adhesive, surface cleaned. The next step was how to reduce that paper discoloration. And the question was, how do you do that when without moving any drawing materials from on the surface of the paper? And what we determined was the safest way to do this was by something called blotter washing. In this case, it was actually, I guess, technically tech wipe washing. We used an absorbent fabric that we had wetted out fully with conditioned water, and we placed the drawing on it face up. And so the fabric was fully wetted with water that we had at a controlled pH of about 7.5 to 8. And that would really encourage the acidity to move from the drawing, from the back of the drawing into this blotter, and without having to move any water on the surface of the drawing. So theoretically, we would see the paper lighten, and we would see that, that discoloration come out onto the blotter or a tech wipe below. So here's an example of a drawing in the back, and you can see it is wetted out fully, but there's not a lot of water on the surface. And so by avoiding that, we're avoiding any potential for moving any of the media like laterally. And so here it is, and here you can see when I lifted the drawing, the discoloration that was left from the blotter wash or the tech wipe wash. And you can even see how that discoloration along the right edge of the drawing, excuse me, is visible along the right edge of this piece of fabric. The next step was mending and filling losses. Unfortunately, I don't have any images of that, but I do have the materials we use. As I mentioned earlier, that paper conservation finds a lot of its roots in inspiration, I'll say, in Japanese screen and scroll mounting. And so we use a lot of their traditional techniques, including wheat starch paste as our primary adhesive and Japanese paper as our ideal mending tissue. So thin pieces of Japanese paper were put on the back to reinforce passages of weakness, and they were adhered with wheat starch paste. We use wheat starch paste because it's been proven to be reversible for thousands of years in just a little bit of moisture, and that's what we like. We like to be reversible as non-invasive as possible. And we filled losses with Japanese paper and reinforced the Japanese paper because it is strong, and it can be strong and thin because it's made in a different way than what traditional Western paper is. So these are sort of the materials we use to do that. So after mending and filling losses and reinforcing weaknesses, particularly on the edges where we had that adhesive staining that had deteriorated the paper significantly, we then humidified the drawings overall, and this is our humidification bubble, and we pressed them, we flattened them with a really smooth Polytex, which is a non-woven polyester on the surface of the drawing to not move or kind of pick up any drawing media when we did that. Again, we found that throughout the course of the treatment, the fact that the drawings were fixed really helped prevent a lot of movement. We didn't see a lot of media movement when we wetted things out, when we tested things, when we put things in contact with the surface, but at the same time, we really limited the amount of movement of water or anything on the surface of the drawing, just to ensure that we kind of maintained the mark making and technique of Marshall Fredericks. So with that, I'll show a couple of before and afters, since those are fun. They're all visible on the website, so if you want to check them out more closely, you can see every single one. This is a drawing where the work was not attached to a window mat. It's one of the larger drawings in the group that we treated. And you can see in the lower right corner, a piece is broken off and a piece is lost. On the back, there's a significant amount of adhesive, and you can see even a little piece of brown paper fragment that we did remove, and just overall the paper is really discolored. So we released all the adhesive on the back, and then we washed the drawing, and then the final step was to mend the tears and fill the losses, and we filled those losses with what we would call a sympathetic paper fill. So it was a fill that was toned to look like the original paper, and it was actually made out of a Western paper. So here it is after. So here is before, and here is after. So the paper is just really much brighter, much healthier. All those little tears and losses are mended and stabilized. And so hopefully that can kind of prevent any potential damage while handling. And overall, we've sort of, really brightened that contrast between the original marks and of the artist and the paper support, kind of trying to restore some of that original quality. Here's another drawing that you saw during this presentation, and on the right, you can see there's a significant amount of water damage that had caused these tide lines and a lot of undulations in the paper support. Again, this is not one that was mounted to a window mat, but you can see that it has a lot of discoloration. And so here it is before and now after. So there is still a light shade of discoloration along that right edge, but we were able to really reduce that mainly by washing. We did do a little bit of localized treatment with a really dilute sodium borohydride, which is a bleach. It's a kind of a conservation bleach because it works in the opposite way in which paper deteriorates. So theoretically, it's not as invasive as the kind of bleach we throw in with our laundry. And but we also it was sort of a balance in terms of washing the drawing, and we don't want to overwash the drawing. This was a really delicate paper, so we felt like we wanted to just sort of soften that line, but we left a little of that discoloration in because the more washing we did, the more we were kind of putting the drawing at risk for further damage. So this was sort of a kind of a delicate balance of finding that right level of intervention. And here is one of our sort of more prototypical drawings. You can see that window mat, you can see those thick pieces of tape on all four edges completely adhering that drawing. And then here it is after. So it's sort of the process that I went through, releasing it, reducing the adhesive, washing the drawing overall, and then finally mending. And I did reinforce all the edges of the verso of the back with a really thin Japanese tissue. And I sort of laughed that there's not a huge before and after, but it was a really significant treatment. And sometimes the best conservation work is something you never see. Ideally, a conservator's work is never seen because we want our work to be really not interventive. We're not artists, we're just preserving things. So this is something where we reduced a lot of discoloration and really brought the work back and just put it in a much safer and more stable place for the future. So with that, I'm going to finish my talk, and I'm really open to any questions people may have. I want to thank the IMLS who supported this, as well as, of course, the Marshall Fredericks, who put all the work into writing these grants, and the NEH, who supported the initial survey, along with my colleagues, Diana Kleiss and Elizabeth.
Thank you, Liz. And I'm just going to add on, because we have a couple of special guests when you, speaking of writing of the grants, the last director at the Marshall Fredericks, Marilyn Wheaton, is on the call today, and Melissa Ford, the previous archivist. And both of them worked together on these grants and this project, again, which started, you know, back probably even before 2010, getting those things ready. So we thank the both of you for all of your work to and your forward thinking to get these important drawings preserved, conserved, and we are excited to be able to share them now and moving forward. So thank you all for everyone that was involved in the process. Yeah, Liz, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat to see if anybody has any questions that way. But yes, we also, you can unmute yourself if you have any questions to ask Liz. I thought maybe you could spend just another minute, Liz. I had a couple of things that I always find interesting. You mentioned about things needing to be reversible and non-invasive. And I wondered if you could just spend a minute kind of talking about that core philosophy in the work that you do.
Yeah, so, you know, some things admittedly are not reversible. For example, when we wash something, we are washing things out of the paper. But in general, we try to make our work as reversible as possible, especially when it comes to sort of aesthetic decisions, like things like in painting. We try to make those things reversible. If we put in a fill or we fill in some image, then we want to make that as reversible as possible, because for us, reversibility is really important. We're thinking of these objects as long-term, and we know that things change over time. Technology changes, science changes. Our research suggests that we can do X, Y, and Z, but in 50 years, that information may change, our knowledge may change. And so we want to make sure that the things that we do can be taken out. We are not the artists. As I said, I think it's really important that our work is, you know, we're trying to be as very transparent in our process and in our work, because we want the work to speak for itself. And because of that, reversibility is really important. I know, you know, especially, I think this is a big deal in paintings conservation, but it does happen in paper too, where you'll see a previous restorer who maybe 30 years ago, or maybe 150 years ago, the fill or the in painting looks great, but over time it's discolored. And if they're using some sort of crazy adhesive, we spend a lot of time taking that off. Or if they use a kind of crazy paint in paintings conservation, they have to use a lot of things to take that off. Versus if you try to do things reversibly, like using wheat starch paste to attach your fill, then you know someone can just come in, and if the colors fade differently from the colors of the original object, someone can come in 50 years and be like, okay, let's take this corner out and let's put in one that looks better, because the original paper has shifted in this direction and this little fill has shifted in another, and suddenly it looks terrible. So we try to be as minimally invasive as possible and as reversible as possible. But sometimes that decision isn't possible, and when it is, we really think about what we know and what we think is most beneficial for the long term for this object.
Thank you. We do have a couple of great questions coming in. This one is coming in, I'm going to call her out by name, Valerie Allen, who is an artist and who's going to be teaching one of our classes. She has a great question. Do conservators have a quote unquote wish that artists would be more aware of in the future with their artwork? Or are conservators understanding that artists are in the moment and may not be thinking of archival materials? So I think that's a great question.
Yeah, it probably depends on the conservator. I think I understand something, you know, artists want certain qualities in a piece, and there's almost an understanding that things aren't permanent. Some materials will fade and you embrace that. So with living artists, and when we do work with them, I think a lot of institutions have sort of a collection policy where they ask questions with the artist, like, what happens if this doesn't last? And conservators will often be like, oh, well, I see they're using this pigment we know will fade. What do they want us to do? So I think having an understanding of how you want something to age is just as important as having an understanding of using the archival materials, because some materials like watercolors are so inherently non-archival. Like a lot of the pigments that are used in watercolors will fade. And we understand that, you know, but just having, if you can have a conversation, or even just recognizing how you want something to age, I think is maybe almost more important, because we don't want to limit the artist. I mean, that's the thing. I like to think as conservators, we really respect artists, and a lot of us are kind of failed artists. I love making art, but all of my art was just kind of very tacky, and my aesthetic sense isn't there. And so I don't want to stop people from creating what they want to make. So it's more about knowing that it may be temporary, and maybe even embracing that. We're not going to try to make things last forever if they're not meant to last forever.
You know, and I love thinking about that question and your answer. We can probably think when looking at these figure studies by Marshall Fredericks, that actually many of them, he might not have actually intended to be artworks on display.
Right.
But they were part of his process as he was trying to understand the human form.
Yes.
And so so he probably, you know, with some of these was very much not thinking of them as being on display later and needing to last a long time. And so using, you know, inexpensive materials that might deteriorate quickly, it wasn't about that, it lasting, it was about helping him in his process.
Right. And so with us, our work really, especially in it's a regional center, we work with a wide variety of things. We're not working exclusively with fine art. Sometimes we're working with archival materials, documents, family photographs. And so for us, it's about understanding what that object means and where its value comes from. We don't value anything, you know, money-wise. I have no idea how much things cost, but we're thinking about what the value is. So in something like drawings, and something that's always appealed to me is that they're often not meant as final works. They're meant as sort of experimental or kind of, you know, kind of practice. And so it's just as important to leave the stray marks and the fingerprints as it is to you know, kind of brighten the paper overall. And so it's very much an understanding of each object and where sort of its intrinsic value comes from, and respecting that primarily above kind of all else, and trying to ensure that we maintain that. That makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Another question that came in, this one from Ernie Pollock, about the best way to store these drawings to maintain the conservation work, or to maintain the drawings. And I think that, you know, you talked to us a lot about the treatment process, but maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the preventive conservation side of things, from storage materials, display materials, and other types of guidelines that we try to set to make sure these are preserved into the future.
Yes, so preventive conservation is, you know, if you have great preventive conservation, that you may never need an actual conservator. Especially works on paper are very light sensitive. Paper ages due to acidity and light. And so reducing the amount of light an object gets is huge for ensuring its long-term kind of life, for making it last as long as possible. And then avoiding acidity. So in terms of display, I recommend almost exclusively to display things behind UV filtering plexiglass, because glass shatters when it breaks and plexiglass doesn't. So by having UV filtering plexi, you can reduce the amount of light that you display something. And when you display it, always display it in a lower lighting situation. You know, you'll often notice, especially in museums, that paperwork collections are often displayed together, and you may not notice as you're walking, but those are often in lower light galleries. And that is because paper is more sensitive to light than something like a canvas oil painting. I also recommend thinking about acid-free materials. So those window mats were really, really, really harmful to these drawings. And so getting acid-free window mats can just really help in terms of reducing the amount of acid that the drawing will be around. It's going to produce acidity, and so are the mats. But if you can reduce the acidity by having new window mats, which they've been put into, a new back mats, that can again reduce that that aging and deterioration. And then let's see, reduce lighting. And then finally, we don't like works of art being displayed. Reducing the amount of time that things are put on display and keeping them in storage that's dark and temperature controlled and relatively minimal humidity and temperature fluctuations. So, you know, I have works of art on paper hanging in my house. So, you know, sometimes things are on display permanently. And if you do that, I would say don't store them anywhere near kitchens or bathrooms, because those fluctuations in humidity can also kind of encourage a lot of that deterioration. But in general, with collections, when possible, things shouldn't be displayed for extended periods of time. Works of art on paper shouldn't be. You know, 3 months is a pretty long period of time for a work of art to be out. Sometimes it can go longer, 6 months, but then after that, we always recommend a significant rest period of a couple of years, because that is all cumulative, and we can't really, you know, we can do these types of interventions, but we can't undo it. And eventually these are materials that will deteriorate. So reducing that also helps. That answers your question.
Right. If a work is faded, you can't magically bring it back. So thank you. We have some, I think we have some conservators or budding conservators or enthusiasts in the audience. A question coming in from Mark Bauer, who missed when you were talking about the adhesive removal, and was wondering, or part of it, and was wondering if you could mention again what chemical and or technique was used in removing the adhesive.
So we found, we did a lot of testing to see what solvents worked. In the case of most of the drawings, we found it was a combination of ethyl acetate and acetone that worked. And that always depends on the tape. Sometimes tapes need stronger things like toluene and xylene. Sometimes things can move in water. Those are the best, which is also a solvent. But in this case, we found that acetone and ethyl acetate were the two best solvents. And what we did was we worked over suction. So that allowed us, as I said, to sort of pull the solvent through the paper, solubilize that adhesive and pull it out of the paper, and work really locally without having to worry about the solvents moving laterally and affecting the drawing media, which is the thing that we want to.
Thanks. You know, and when you just mentioned that having to test out a few different chemicals, it made me think again about the importance of the documentation. And so all of the treatments that you did and all of the adhesives, the wheat paste and things like that are all documented, so that moving forward, if something does need to be reversed, we would be able to look up what the chemical composition of what was used and be able to treat it accordingly without having to do more invasive testing.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, and if you see over time that things are changing in different areas, yeah, you can test, and you know that this happened here and this didn't happen here. So yeah.
Anyone who's not using the chat to ask questions, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Liz directly?
This is Judith Ellison. Is having a work on paper an expensive proposition for an individual? I mean, I collect works on paper, and I have some that need attention, but I know you can't give me a price, but can you give me some advice?
Yeah, so in terms of storing things, I think having things properly framed, sometimes it's more worth the investment to frame things than to conserve them. So to have things properly framed, to see, you know, if you have things that you want to display or store, to just chat with a framer and to talk to them about acid-free mat board, UV filtering plexiglass. And I forgot to mention, we recommend using Japanese paper and wheat starch paste as hinge material, so the thing that actually attaches the drawing to the whole framing package, because that's a very nice and reversible way, as opposed to any sort of like hinging tapes or things like that. talking to your framer, if you have a framer, you work with someone who frames things, and just making sure that they are doing things sort of to that standard is going to really help you. And then in terms of conserving things, we at MACC do conserve people's private collections. So we have examinations that we carry out, and there's a certain fee associated with that. And during those examinations, we look at the work, we get a sense of the issues we're seeing, and we even can estimate a price based on the individual object. So yeah, that's something you can consider if you're interested. And we do kind of, sometimes I can, if you have something that you want, if you just want to send me an image of it, I can kind of look at it, at least kind of get a sense of things sometimes, just by some photographs. But yeah, we do treat work here that are not institutional. That's the kind of beauty of working at MACC. We work with a really wide variety of clients, including, you know, people.
Thank you.
Janet Martineau here. Pick any one of the pieces that you displayed and give me an estimate. How long did it take to do that whole process? And then secondly, take one of those pieces and where will it be maybe 30 years from now?
Hopefully 30 years from now in a very similar condition. I mean, the Marshall Fredericks.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll store it properly. It's a really great institution, and we're really happy to work with them because we know that the works are in good hands. And so ideally, because things will be displayed in a limited amount and they've now been reframed and rehoused, these things should look pretty good in 30 years. You know, that's what we hope. In terms of how long it took, it's kind of hard to say. You know, multiple days. We work on things piecemeal. In terms of washing, for example, you know, surface cleaning doesn't take a very long time. You saw the video of me releasing it from the window mat. That didn't take very long. But solvents take time depending on how much they want to move. And so that really varied per object. It was really interesting to see that even though the tape seemed to be the same across most of these drawings, sometimes the tape would just like, whoop, it would come out like in that video. And then sometimes it would take hours upon hours of solvent treatment, like a day or two of solvent treatment, like done over the course of a week. And washing, blotter washing, is actually a very slow process because we do immersion wash certain things like prints where the ink is really stable. We can actually fully submerge a work on paper. But in the case of these drawings, we did not want to have water moving over the surface. So we did this blotter washing technique. And by doing that, it's very slow. So that took multiple days of blotter washing for each drawing, maybe 2 to 3. And by days, I mean, I would come in at around 9 o'clock and by 10 have a drawing on the blotter, and maybe 3 or 4 o'clock, I would be removing it from the blotter. And during that process, you kind of rotate the blotter, the thing below it, to sort of encourage more movement and movement of the discoloration products. And so, you know, every half hour to an hour, I would rinse out the blotter, put it in fresh water, and put the drawing back on top. So, and that would be, you know, maybe 2 or 3 days of blotter washing for each work.
And you'd really concentrate on that piece instead of trying to do 2 or 3 different pieces a day.
Well, the beauty of blotter washing is you put the piece on the blotter, you know you don't have water on the surface, and you just let it sit, and it just kind of relaxes in the bath. That's the nice thing about when you bathe a drawing, you let it relax in the bathtub. So so it's, you know, you check on it every hour and you rotate things, but then for a good 45 minutes, you could be working on something else. You could be surface cleaning another drawing or releasing another drawing. And so we try to multitask without getting distracted. And when we're doing something that we can trust and know is safe, then we can do that and kind of feel comfortable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lynn Kenline. I'm a paper conservator. You did a really nice job of describing your process and great recording of your in action. I just wanted to stress that if you have works on paper, ask for advice before you take it to the frame shop. I've seen so many things that are damaged by framers who either don't know or don't care. And it's very frustrating when somebody brings me something that they just paid hundreds of dollars to have framed, and then they ask me, did they use the right adhesive? Well, it's like, well, I would have to open this up to tell you. Do you really want me to do that? So,
right. So having that conversation in the beginning is really important.
You almost have to have a basic knowledge about works of art on paper. Like, for instance, if you're purchasing a print that has a couple of foxing spots on it. I had a friend who did have a print, and the framer just went ahead and framed it anyway. And the buyer didn't realize that the foxing is probably going to spread under the frame, you know?
Right. Yeah, it can get worse. And yeah, it's important to, especially when acquiring things, to look at something before you have it framed. Yeah, and if you see anything, look at it closely. If you see anything that bothers you, then to talk to a conservator. That's a true point, before things are framed, because you can get into trouble if you get something framed and things like catch, unfortunately, and you have a little tear and it gets caught during the framing process, and suddenly some big corner tears off, or those kinds of things.
I'm going to ask another question about the paper that Marshall Fredericks used that you conserved. Was it rag paper? All rag paper on the prints that you conserved, that you had to take the adhesive off?
There was the two larger drawings, maybe. I can't say definitively. I'd have to, sort of do an actual fiber analysis, which we didn't do. But based on the kind of quality of the paper, the brittleness and the discoloration, and how severe it was for something that's only 50 years old, my logic is it likely had a wood pulp component, and that's probably what caused it to be so orange and discolored so rapidly. But it could also be, it's in combination with the fact that it probably had a significant amount of light, and also the storage, the window mats.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Mark Bauer. I was most amazed by the ability to remove wrinkles from the paper, because some of them were, just amazingly wrinkled and came out like almost perfectly flat, it seems. So I know you said you put the paper on like a non-woven fabric, so otherwise you'd get the imprint of the fabric in the paper, right? But is there kind of mechanical pressure or something applied to?
So we have book presses, like actual presses for books, and we also just have sort of what we call flattening stations, which are really just layers of thick blotter, which is sort of a really pure kind of absorbent paper, and a big piece of plexiglass and a lot of weights. So yeah, we did put a lot of weights, and so we kind of sandwiched it between absorbent papers and then put a lot of weight on it. And so that by doing that, we would get them really humid, and then we put that pressure on them, but we would control the drying both in terms of pressure and the amount of like moisture that was allowed to escape. So it'd be a very slow drying, and that was a way to really control it, because if it dried too quickly, the paper could kind of pull back, but if it dries slowly, it's not going to shift as much, and that could really reduce those undulations.
Thank you.
We have another question coming in from Ernie Pollock, and this question would probably not be for you, Liz, although you may have seen evidence. We do have a few of Marshall Fredericks' family members that in the audience that might be able to answer this, or some longtime museum staff. But the question is, where and how did Marshall store these drawings? And I think that there definitely is some evidence if there was some matting, and I believe I heard some of them were framed, but Suki or Fran, do you have any recollection of where these stored, or were they displayed?
Yes, I recall them well, because I was the one who did a really rudimentary triage on some of them, which were when they were attached to even worse things that you encountered. They were located in a studio in junky boxes, cardboard boxes, junky, unlined wood drawers. The studio atmosphere was not humidity or temperature controlled. They had, some of them had really bad backing boards, which is why they were, what you've came across. Some of them were just, had the window mats on them. But the fact is they were matted, which is interesting to me because they were clearly, figure studies probably done in his, he would have, a group of artists at the studio with a model, and they do that in the 50s and 60s and on kind of a routine basis. And I suspect that some of these came out of those, but then he selected some, obviously, that had more interest to him. He must have exhibited them at some point to bother to put them in mats. That's my suspicion. So they were, yes, a process. The experience of drawing from a model is part of the training for, everybody to stay in shape with the form. But there were some he clearly valued beyond that.
Suki, is junky a technical term?
Junk, yeah, I use it a lot.
Okay, I'm just curious.
I wonder, thank you for that, Suki. I wonder too if, because what we found, at least for these 25, is that they were all kind of from a particular era, around in the 50s mostly. And I'm wondering if even some of the matting was for him to use as a way to handle them for reference, for working reference, into the future as well, to make that very fragile, lightweight, thin, delicate newsprint paper more durable if he wanted to, reference muscular structure or something. Who knows? But just a thought.
Yeah, I don't know. I just remember a lot of rubber cement, which you didn't get to see too much of, relatively speaking.
That might be a thing back to Valerie Allen's question. No tapes and no rubber cement to artists unless it's part of your your visual process or something.
Right. We have a sign actually in front of the paper lab entrance that says no tape here, because a lot of our job is taking off tape and removing it. And it's tapes age differently, but it's often a very slow and kind of painful process of removing tape. But yeah, and then the irony is that my husband works for 3M, so he's the enemy. But he doesn't work in the adhesives division, so that's the only way we're still married. But yes, the Scotch tape is, it's a lot of our job. So we're very anti-tape.
I just want to take an opportunity to introduce MJ Davis, who's here tonight, because she worked on a number of my dad's watercolors and drawings that I had. And she's handled some of his works on paper as well. So,
what media have you used? Were they charcoal or pencil or what? Or what
drawings?
media were the drawings?
They mainly appeared to be black chalk, and some had some white chalk, and there was a few that seemed to be like a soft vine charcoal. That's what it looked like. It mainly looked like to me to be black chalk. It was a little hard. I was just talking with Diana, my colleague, about that because they were so well consolidated. Usually you kind of do a look at them under magnification, and you look at the kind of structure of the media. But because they're so consolidated, it was a little hard to tell. But my read, it was mainly black chalk.
I was thinking maybe they were charcoal, but.
Okay. Liz, another question for you. Any references, sources of information that you would recommend for amateurs that wanted to learn and dabble in art conservation? And yeah, after listening to all of the schooling that you went to, I think that's definitely be good to hear from you as far as what even you think is a safe place to dabble and the place not to dabble.
Yeah, I mean, dabbling is a little not recommended. If you're interested in art conservation, I think reaching out to institutions and chatting with conservators, sometimes they're happy to take volunteers to work in their labs. That's what I did before I went to graduate school, and that also includes library settings. Libraries have book labs where they treat and conserve books and works and things on paper. So sometimes you can actually learn there, and sort of get a sense of how to do certain things. And in terms of books, of course, I think of the most boring, interesting to me, but maybe boring sounding book called Water and Paper, which outlines in a textbook the relationship between water and paper and how that works, because it's a huge part of paper conservation. But I think looking up, the Getty Institute, the Getty Institute for Conservation in Los Angeles, they have a lot of free texts online about different types of conservation. So if you want to just sort of read about that and learn about that. And I also recommend going to the AIC website, the American Institute for Conservation. I show that at the end of my PowerPoint. It is, it's our big association, and it is really a great resource for finding conservators, for learning more about conservation, just sort of getting a sense of what the field is, what we do, and just getting to know that. But in terms of dabbling, that may, I'm a little wary to encourage that. But if you're interested in becoming a conservator or working with a conservator, that is something that you can absolutely do.
Liz, how do you recommend securing a drawing or a photograph in a mat or a frame without using adhesives?
Photo corners. Photo corners are a great way, especially with things like photographs, where you don't want to introduce adhesive because it's going to be too sensitive. If you can safely put corners on something, and you can buy really nice stable ones, that is a great way to secure something. Non-adhesive is always ideal. So that's a great question, and photo corners are the thing to do. I'm trying to think of, I think university products and Talus. Talus is mainly a supplier for more kind of conservation products, but University Products is a great supplier for materials like if you want to store a bunch of drawings and you want to buy a nice asset-free box, or I believe they do have a variety of nice stable photo corners. So there are kind of stable plastic photo corners and stable paper photo corners, but that is the best way to do it pretty easily.
Thank you.
DIY that I do recommend.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was thinking that preventive conservation is actually, also a great place to dabble, I would say.
Yes, yes.
To learn about and dabble is to learn about active measures that we can take in preventing damage and risk. And I would also say that a lot of museums, historical societies, things like that are more comfortable having volunteers come in and help them with preventive conservation measures versus treatments that involve solvents and things like that. And so, and it's a whole world in and of itself, and very fascinating as well. So that is another area I think that you could dabble in.
Very true. Yes. Collections managers are, I think, always needing more help, and especially in historical societies and things like that, just to rehouse things and to store things properly, build proper boxes for objects. That stuff is really, really, really important. And there are a lot of really well-trained people who can teach you a lot about how to do that.
Well, thank you, Liz. We are at 8:06. I'm just wondering if anyone has any final questions before we close out today.
Thank you, Liz. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I want to extend that as well. We thank you, all of the staff, all of Marshall's appreciators and followers, and for all the people in the future who may not even know Marshall Fredericks yet, or have not yet even been born, to the conservators who help ensure that his work and legacy carries on into the future. So thank you for so carefully treating and caring for his works on paper. and giving us guidance on how to carry that forward.
Great. All right, thank you.
Thank you everyone again for joining us tonight. Again, go back to explore the exhibition some more and look at that calendar events for more programs. And we hope to see you again soon.